Have you ever spent years standing beside someone, never realizing they might be the love of your life? For Daniel Prescott, a 45-year-old CEO, and Maggie Turner, his trusted secretary of 6 years, their story began not with a grand romantic gesture, but with a blind date neither of them wanted. What followed was a storm of public rumors, personal sacrifice, and a choice that could cost Daniel his career, or win him a love that would change his life forever. Imagine this: you've built your reputation over decades, and suddenly the person you care about most is accused of betraying the company you lead. Do you protect them and risk everything you've worked for, or walk away to save yourself tonight? You'll witness a journey that's not about perfect fairy tales, but about finding a safe harbor when the waves are highest. It's about courage, truth, and the quiet kind of love that can anchor you for a lifetime. If this kind of story touches you, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and help us share more moments like this. And now, let's step into a rainy night in Charleston, where one unexpected meeting changes everything. A fine mist had settled over Charleston that evening, softening the edges of its cobblestone streets and turning every gas lamp into a glowing halo. Rain slicked the bricks beneath Daniel Prescott's polished shoes, and the faint scent of salt water drifted in from the harbor, mixing with the earthy smell of wet magnolia leaves. It was the kind of night most people would spend indoors, curled up with a book or a good movie. Daniel, however, found himself standing outside the Harbor Lights Jazz Club, wondering how on earth he had let his mother talk him into this. The club's old brick facade gleamed under the lamplight, the green awning sagging slightly from the mist. Through the tall windows, he could see silhouettes moving to the slow sway of a saxophone, the golden light spilling onto the sidewalk. A blind date. At 45. With a business quarter closing in less than 2 weeks. He should have been at his desk, reviewing numbers, not standing here like a teenager about to walk into a school dance. His mother, Eleanor Prescott, sharp as ever at 78, had been persistent. "You've been alone long enough." "Danny," she'd said over Sunday dinner, her blue eyes narrowing the way they did when she was closing a deal. And no, I don't care about your board meetings. Daniel had tried every excuse: deadlines, travel, even a sudden interest in repainting his kitchen. But Eleanor knew her son's calendar better than his own secretary did. And that secretary, Margaret Maggie Turner, was the one who had dutifully cleared tonight for him. Now, with the low hum of a trumpet slipping through the club's door, Daniel pulled in a breath and stepped inside. Warmth and music embraced him immediately, the rich scent of polished wood and aged bourbon curling in the air. The place was half-lit, the kind of lighting that invited whispers and made everyone look a little more mysterious. A hostess with a knowing smile approached him. "Mr. Prescott, your table's just over here." He followed her through a maze of small, round tables draped in white linen, weaving between couples, leaning close over candlelight. Then he saw her, in the far corner. By the window where rain traced silver paths down the glass sat a woman in a navy blue dress that caught the light in subtle waves. Her auburn hair, usually swept neatly into a bun, at the office fell in soft curls over her shoulders. She looked up at him, green eyes steady, with the faintest curve of surprise on her lips. Maggie, his secretary, the woman who had kept his world running for 6 years with clockwork precision. The one who knew when he needed coffee before he did, who shielded him from calls when he was too deep in thought, who kept his schedule so airtight that his life outside work barely existed. For 6 years, she'd been the woman behind his schedule, until tonight. He stopped in his tracks, his hand still on the back of the chair the hostess had pulled out for him. "Mr. Prescott," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough over the muted melody of the piano. "I think we've both been ambushed." Daniel blinked, the corners of his mouth twitching despite himself. "Looks that way." He sat down slowly, studying her like she was someone he'd never met before. Without the structured suits and the no-nonsense bun, she seemed younger somehow, warmer. He realized he'd never seen her outside the sterile light of the office, never wondered what she did when she wasn't in her corner of the 12th floor, typing away at his emails. Maggie folded her hands on the table, her nails painted a muted coral. "My Aunt Carol and your mother, apparently they've been conspiring for weeks." Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting out a quiet, incredulous laugh. "Of course they have." The waiter approached, placing 2 glasses of red wine on the table without asking. Compliments of Mrs. Prescott, he said with a wink before retreating. Daniel shook his head. "She really doesn't give up, does she?" "Neither does Aunt Carol," Maggie replied, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "I only found out who I was meeting an hour ago." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The saxophone's low murmur filled the space between them, the candlelight casting shadows across her face. Daniel took a sip of wine, still trying to reconcile the Maggie he thought he knew with the one sitting across from him now. Something about this felt unmoored, like stepping onto a deck and realizing the tide had shifted under your feet. He'd come here expecting to endure an awkward dinner with a stranger, to smile politely and then retreat to his quiet home and his paperwork. Instead, he was looking at the one person who had been in his life every weekday for 6 years, yet, somehow, he was realizing he'd never really seen her. Outside, the rain fell harder, tapping against the window in a slow, steady rhythm. Maggie tilted her head slightly, as if weighing whether to speak. Her lips parted, and that's when a burst of laughter from a nearby table cut through the moment, pulling them both back. Daniel set his glass down, leaning forward just slightly. "So, do we pretend this never happened, or do we see where it goes?" Her smile was small but genuine, her eyes holding his. "I suppose that depends on whether you can see me as more than just your secretary." The question lingered in the air, as soft and charged as the music surrounding them. Outside, a distant foghorn sounded from the harbor. Inside, Daniel realized this dinner might not be something he could simply walk away from, and neither of them knew that tonight's conversation would set off a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. For a long moment, the two of them simply sat there, the silence between them filled by the velvety hum of the jazz quartet in the corner. Daniel let his eyes wander around the club as if he might catch sight of a trapdoor he could slip through. Maggie was studying the rim of her wine glass, her fingers tracing the delicate stem like it might tell her what to say next. "Busy day?" Daniel finally asked, the most neutral question he could muster. Maggie's lips quirked faintly. Same as always. Emails, phone calls, and convincing the copier not to jam before your 2 meeting. He gave a short laugh, though it felt out of place here, among the low light and the faint perfume of someone's cologne drifting past their table. "You've always had a talent for crisis management." Her eyes lifted to his, a flicker of something unspoken in them. "It's part of the job description." They lingered there for a beat, trading small comments about the weather, about how crowded the harbor had been that morning. All the while, Daniel noticed how different she seemed here, more relaxed, her shoulders not squared in that practiced office posture. The music shifted, the bass walking a slow, sensual line. A fresh pour of Cabernet arrived at their table, deep and ruby under the candlelight. Daniel swirled his glass, trying to push past the awkwardness. "So," he said, "did Aunt Carol give you any warning about this little ambush?" Maggie's gaze dropped again, and he caught the faintest blush at her cheeks. Not exactly. She called this afternoon, told me she had tickets to a jazz club and thought I should come. Then she mentioned your mother would be here too, only she wasn't. Daniel arched a brow. You're telling me my mother faked her own attendance to get me here. She's a resourceful woman, Maggie said, and this time her smile was genuine, softening the lines of her face. They sipped their wine in companionable quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist, and the window beside them fogged from the warmth inside. Then Maggie set her glass down, fingers laced together on the table. There's something you should probably know. Daniel. The way she said his first name, not Mr. Prescott, but Daniel made him lean in slightly. All right. She drew a breath. I'm a writer. He tilted his head, not sure he understood. You mean, report speeches? Her lips pressed into a faint smile. No. Novels. Under the pen name Grace Holloway. Daniel's mind flipped through memories, trying to place the name. Then it hit him hard. Grace Holloway. The one who writes those harbor romances my mother devours like candy. Maggie gave a small nod. That would be me. He sat back, utterly floored. He'd seen stacks of those books on his mother's coffee table, their covers painted with schooners at sunset and women in windblown dresses. You're telling me, for the last 6 years, you've been running my calendar by day and writing best-selling novels by night? Her expression carried both pride and a touch of apprehension. It's not as glamorous as it sounds. Most nights it's me, my laptop, and a cup of chamomile tea. Daniel shook his head slowly, still wrapping his mind around it. My mother swears Grace Holloway knows more about shipyards than most of my engineers. Maggie's smile turned wry. Some of those stubborn captains in my books might remind you of someone you know. He caught the glimmer in her eyes and narrowed his own in mock suspicion. Should I be flattered or concerned? Depends on the chapter, she replied, her tone light but her gaze steady. Daniel let out a low laugh, surprised at how much the tension had eased. He realized he was leaning forward now, elbows on the table, drawn in by this entirely new version of the woman he thought he'd known. I can't believe you've kept this a secret, he said. Why? Maggie hesitated, her fingers absently circling the base of her wine glass. At first, I didn't want anyone at work to take me less seriously. Being the novelist might make people think I wasn't focused. And then, the book started selling. Keeping the two worlds separate just seemed easier. Daniel considered that, the jazz melody wrapping around them like a silk ribbon. He knew about keeping parts of yourself locked away. It was safer that way, but looking at her now, he wondered what else he'd missed while keeping his head buried in work. A couple nearby burst into applause as the saxophonist slid into a long, soulful note. The candle between them flickered, and Daniel found himself asking, so which one am I, the hero, the villain, the comic relief? Maggie's laughter was soft, like the clink of glass on glass. Let's just say you've inspired elements. He raised his glass to her, a silent toast to secrets revealed. Well, Grace Holloway, I suppose I have some reading to do. Her lips curved in that subtle smile again, and for the first time all evening, she looked entirely at ease. Somewhere deep inside, Daniel felt the faint, surprising stir of anticipation. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streetlights shimmering against the wet brick. Inside, the space between them felt just a little smaller than it had when the night began. Neither of them noticed the hostess by the door, discreetly handing a folded note to the maitre d'. It bore a familiar signature E.P., and in the quiet shadow of the club, a new game was already in motion. Daniel had always thought of novels as something his mother read on rainy Sundays, comfort between hardcovers, not the kind of thing that might hold his attention. Yet 2 days after that unexpected evening at the Harbor Lights Jazz Club, he found himself propped against his leather couch, a copy of Harbor's Promise open in his hands. The cover was exactly what he remembered seeing on Eleanor's coffee table, a schooner at dusk, its sails catching the last blush of the sun. But it wasn't the painting that unsettled him, it was the words. By the 3rd chapter, he was reading about a shipyard so vividly rendered that he could smell the varnish and salt air. The way the cranes creaked when they swung heavy hulls into the water, the cadence of the workers' banter, even the faint metallic taste of the coffee brewed in the break room's dented percolator. He knew these details. They weren't generic port scenes from a travel brochure. They were his shipyard Prescott Marine holdings, down to the stubborn foreman who refused to wear his safety goggles and the intern who kept feeding seagulls from his lunch pail. He closed the book, staring at the ceiling for a moment. Had she really been observing all this while quietly scheduling his meetings and fielding his calls the next morning? When Maggie arrived at the office, hair swept into its usual neat bun, gray skirt suit pressed to perfection, Daniel watched her from his glass-walled office. She set her coffee mug, blue ceramic, chipped at the rim down beside her keyboard, then glanced toward him. Their eyes met. She smiled just a small, professional curve of her lips, but it lingered a heartbeat longer than usual. By mid-morning, he found himself at her desk under the pretense of asking about a client file. "Good weekend?" he asked casually. "It was productive," she said, sliding a folder toward him. "Yours?" He hesitated, then allowed the truth. "I read one of your books." Her hand stilled for half a second before she busied herself with her pen, and Daniel tapped the folder against the desk. "I think I know your shipyard?" That earned him a flicker of a grin. "Maybe. Or maybe you just think you do." It became a quiet rhythm over the next week, mornings filled with conference calls and emails, afternoons punctuated by the briefest exchanges across the office floor, and somewhere in between. Daniel was working his way through another Grace Holloway novel. On Thursday, he caught himself lingering in the break room just to pour his coffee at the same time she did. "There's a photography exhibit at the Maritime Museum," he mentioned as casually as he could. Historic harbor shots might be worth seeing. Maggie's brow lifted. "Are you inviting me, Mr. Prescott?" He cleared his throat. "Daniel. And yes, I suppose I am." Saturday found them walking side by side through the museum's quiet halls. The black and white photographs showed Charleston's docks a century ago, men in flat caps loading crates, women in long skirts standing on weathered planks. "They worked in these same waters," Maggie said softly, pausing before an image of a young woman holding a ledger. "Different time, same grit." Daniel studied her profile, the way her gaze seemed to drink in the past. He realized he'd never gone to a museum with someone who looked at history like it was a living thing. They ended the afternoon with a slow stroll along the pier. The wind coming off the Atlantic teased loose strands of her hair, and she didn't seem to mind. Daniel found himself telling her stories from his early days at the company, mistakes he'd made, lessons learned the hard way. She listened without judgment, laughing in the right places, her eyes warm in the late daylight. The following week brought another unexpected intersection of their lives. Daniel was leaving a board lunch downtown when he spotted her across the street, standing outside a little cafe with a paper bag in hand. "You come here often?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "They make the best sourdough in Charleston," she said, "and their clam chowder's not bad either." He ended up joining her for lunch, sitting at a corner table with bowls of chowder and slices of warm bread between them. The conversation wandered easily. Books, travel, the kind of seafood worth driving an hour for. For the first time in years, Daniel noticed the sound of his own laugh, full and unguarded. It startled him a little. That night, back at his house, he stood by the window looking out at the harbor lights. It struck him how quickly she'd become part of his thoughts outside the office. He wasn't sure when it had happened, maybe at the museum, maybe that first night at the jazz club, but there was a thread now, connecting his days in a way that felt lighter. In the office, nothing had changed on the surface. She still handed him his schedule each morning, still answered the phone with crisp efficiency. But there was a quiet awareness between them, woven into the way they paused a moment longer at each other's desks, or how their eyes met in the elevator without a word. Late Friday afternoon, as the winter sun dipped low, Daniel stopped by her desk on his way out. "Any plans this weekend?" She glanced up from her screen. "Maybe a walk by the water, if the weather holds." "You?" He smiled. "Might see you there." She tilted her head, amused. Daniel didn't answer, just gave a small wave as he left. Outside, the air was crisp, the smell of the sea sharp in his lungs. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was looking forward to the weekend, not for the quiet it promised, but for the possibility it held. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew that the distance between their professional lives and something more was growing just a little smaller each day. It began on a Tuesday morning, the kind where the harbor fog lingered longer than it should, curling against the 12th floor windows of Prescott Marine Holdings. Daniel was halfway through a briefing when his phone buzzed a news alert his assistant had flagged. Charleston literary bloggers Grace Holloway, hiding in plain sight at Prescott Marine. The headline pulled at his attention like a sudden undertow. He tapped the link under the table. There, on the screen, was a grainy photo of the company's main shipyard. Beside it, a passage from one of Maggie's novels, describing the sound of gulls circling the dock cranes, the precise hue of the paint peeling on the east warehouse door. The blogger posed the question with smug curiosity. Our sources say these details aren't invented, they're observed. Could the elusive Grace Holloway be walking the very halls of Prescott Marine? Daniel looked up from the screen, his gaze cutting through the glass wall toward Maggie's desk. She was there, answering a call, her voice calm, her posture as composed as ever. But when she hung up and glanced toward him, there was a flicker just enough for him to see the unease beneath her steady expression. After the meeting, he stepped into the hallway just as she was passing with a folder in hand. "Morning," he said lightly. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she replied, a shade too quickly. Why Daniel studied her face. "You seem distracted." She hesitated, clutching the folder a little tighter. "Just didn't sleep well. Deadlines." Then she was moving again, disappearing into the copy room before he could ask more. The rest of the day passed in its usual rhythm, but Daniel noticed the small changes, how she kept her phone face down on her desk, how her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. And more than once, he caught her looking out toward the harbor like she was somewhere else entirely. That evening, Maggie sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open but untouched. The blogger's article was still on her screen, the cursor blinking in the empty reply box of an unsent email. Should she tell Daniel part of her wanted to walk into his office tomorrow and explain everything, how she'd taken notes during her early days at the company? Not to expose anyone, but to capture the pulse of the harbor she loved. How the details she used were things any passerby could see if they cared enough to look. But she also knew how it would sound. To the board, to the press. It wouldn't matter that she'd changed names, dates, events. All they would see was that the CEO's secretary had been publishing stories set in a world far too close to reality. She closed the laptop with a sigh and reached for her tea, its warmth doing little to settle her nerves. The next morning, she arrived early, hoping the quiet office would give her time to think, but as she stepped off the elevator, Daniel was already there, leaning against the reception desk with 2 coffees in hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, holding one out to her. She took it, grateful for the familiar ritual. "Thanks." His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual. "If there's something you need to talk about, you know you can." Her heart gave a quick, uneasy beat. "I know." She left it at that, not trusting herself to say more. By midday, the tension she'd been trying to contain found its way into her work, misplacing a report, sending a memo to the wrong department. Small things, but enough for her to notice Daniel watching her from across the office, his brow faintly furrowed. That night, the harbor wind rattled her windows. She stood by the glass, looking out at the lighthouse beam sweeping across the dark water. If the truth came out, would he think she'd betrayed him, or would he understand the answer came, in a way, before she could decide? At 7:42 a.m. the following morning, every member of the Prescott Marine Board received an email from an untraceable address. The subject line was plain confidential. The body was not. Your CEO's secretary is writing about your company's secrets. The boardroom on the top floor of Prescott Marine Holdings was usually a place for calm, measured discussions about contracts and quarterly projections. That morning, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Daniel stepped through the double glass doors to find every seat around the long mahogany table filled. The blinds were drawn against the bright Charleston sun, making the room feel tighter, the air heavier. At the far end, Robert Gaines, the board's chairman, sat with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. To Robert's right was Linda Carver, lips pressed thin, a manila folder in front of her like a weapon. "We all know why we're here," Robert began, his voice low but carrying. "The email sent yesterday has raised serious concerns about confidentiality and reputational risk." Linda didn't wait for him to finish. "Concerns. Robert, this is a crisis. Your CEO's secretary has been using her position to gather sensitive information and publish it in romance novels. I don't see how this is even up for debate. She needs to be removed immediately." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Let's be clear. Linda, Margaret Turner, has done nothing but her job, and she's done it better than most people I've ever worked with. She's brought more integrity to this company than some people in this room." Linda's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, another board member slid a thick stack of paper across the table. "You should see this before you keep defending her." Daniel picked it up, glancing at the top page. It wasn't a report, it was a manuscript. The title page bore a name he knew all too well now, by Grace Holloway. "This is her next book," the board member said. "Not yet published. We obtained it through a contact at her publishing house." Linda leaned forward, voice sharpening. "Page 213. Read it." Daniel flipped through, his eyes scanning the passage. It described a series of suspicious financial transfers hidden in the ledgers of a fictional shipbuilding company. The sums, the dates, even the method of concealment, every detail mirrored a real internal investigation currently underway at Prescott Marine. Only 3 people outside the audit team knew those specifics. He looked up slowly. "How did she get this? That's what we'd all like to know," Linda shot back. "And if she'll put it in a book, she'll put anything in a book." Daniel's first instinct was to shield her, but the resemblance between fiction and reality was undeniable. The boardroom doors opened, and Maggie stepped inside. She looked composed, navy dress, hair pinned back, but Daniel could see the flicker of tension in her eyes. Robert gestured to a seat at the far end. "Ms. Turner, you've heard the concern. We need to know, where did this material come from?" Maggie glanced at Daniel before answering. "From my imagination." Linda scoffed. "Don't insult us. This is word for word the same as what's under investigation right now." "It's fiction," Maggie said evenly. Then she leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting through the room like a keel slicing water. "But if it sounds familiar, maybe that says something about what's really happening here." Silence fell. Daniel saw it, how her words landed like a marker buoy, bobbing right over something hidden. He watched as one board member, a man named Calhoun, shifted in his chair. His hand went to his tie, loosening it. Then, without a word, he pushed back his chair and left the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the sound seemed to echo. Robert's eyes followed Calhoun's exit before returning to Maggie. "That's a serious insinuation." Maggie didn't flinch. "I don't make insinuations, Mr. Gaines. I write stories, and sometimes the truth finds its way into them." Linda opened her mouth, but Robert lifted a hand to stop her. "Daniel, I think this is something we'll need to examine more closely. For now, Ms. Turner will remain in her position until we verify facts. This meeting is adjourned." Chairs scraped, murmurs rose, but Daniel stayed seated, watching Maggie as she gathered her things. She didn't look triumphant, only tired, as though speaking those words had cost her more than anyone here could see. As the board members filed out, Daniel stood and crossed to her. He searched for the right word. "Necessary." She finished for him. Outside the boardroom, the Charleston harbor stretched into the distance, calm and gleaming in the midday sun. But inside, Daniel knew the tides had just shifted, and not only for the company. By sunrise the next morning, Charleston was already humming with a different kind of tide, one made not of water, but of rumors. The first wave came from the Charleston Daily. A headline splashed across the lifestyle section: "Grace Holloway, unmasked romance novelist, or corporate canary within hours." The national business wires picked it up. Cable news programs ran side-by-side images, Maggie's author headshot next to a grainy photo of Prescott Marine's headquarters. Social media was less kind. Some readers praised her for lifting the veil on corporate life. Others accused her of betraying her employer. On a local Charleston forum, an anonymous user posted, "I used to work at Prescott. Those books dead on. Names changed, but we all know who's who." By 9 o'clock, Maggie felt every pair of eyes in the office trailing her as she walked the hallway. The click of her heels seemed louder than usual against the polished floor. She kept her gaze low, holding a folder like a shield. At the break room, a junior accountant leaned against the counter, coffee cup in hand. "Morning, Maggie," he said, too casually. "So, am I in your next novel?" The room chuckled. Maggie smiled faintly, poured her coffee, and stirred in a single packet of sugar, exactly the way she'd done every morning for 6 years. But inside, her stomach tightened. Even the sanctuary of her neighborhood felt altered. The barista at her corner cafe tried for a supportive tone. "Hang in there, Han," but the two women at the next table tilted their phones just enough to capture her profile. At the post office, the clerk winked and said, "Can't wait to see if the captain gets the girl." On her walk home, Maggie passed the harbor. The masts clinked against each other in the cool breeze, and gulls cut low arcs over the water. Usually, this sight calmed her. But tonight, She couldn't shake the feeling that even the sea had turned its gaze on her. At Prescott Marine, Daniel maintained a deliberate professionalism in public. In meetings, his tone was even. In the corridors, he didn't linger near her desk. Their lunches, once a quietly shared ritual, were replaced with him eating alone in his office. But in fleeting moments, a quick handoff of a document, an unexpected meeting in the supply room, his eyes told another story, a steady, unflinching, "I'm here." Those glances were almost worse than silence, because they carried something she feared she couldn't protect him from. Late at night, Maggie sat at the small desk in her apartment. Her reading lamp threw a circle of light over her notebook, but the pen in her hand remained still. Out beyond the window, the harbor was a silver blur in the moonlight. She thought of the boardroom days earlier, of Daniel's voice, firm, unwavering, cutting through the accusations like a keel through choppy water. He had risked his reputation for her without hesitation, but Prescott Marine was his life's work. It bore his name. If the pressure mounted, the board might look for someone to take the fall. And who better than the man who had allowed his secretary to publish thinly disguised company dramas? Her pen rolled off the desk and clinked against the hardwood. She let it lie there. The days blurred together. A journalist from the Post and Courier waiting outside the building with a notepad. An email from a stranger accusing her of romanticizing greed. A local book club inviting her to tell us the real story. One night, she dreamt of being back at the Harbor Lights Jazz Club, except the room was empty and every table was set with microphones instead of glasses. She woke with her heart racing. On Friday morning, as she sorted through a stack of invoices, Daniel walked past her desk without breaking stride. But as he passed, he set a folded slip of paper on the corner of her keyboard. "We'll weather this. Don't let them change who you are." Her fingers brushed over the words. She slipped the note into her top drawer, along with the few other mementos she'd kept over the years, a ticket stub from the photo exhibit they'd gone to, a seashell he'd picked up on a walk by the marina. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough to quiet the noise in her mind for the rest of the morning. That evening, she stayed late at the office, long after most of the staff had gone. The hum of the vending machine was the only sound. She walked to the window overlooking the harbor, the water black and smooth under the street lamps. Daniel's reflection appeared beside hers in the glass. "You shouldn't still be here," he said quietly. "Neither should you." They stood in silence, the city lights stretching across the water like spilled gold. Finally, Maggie said, "I hate that you're in this because of me." He shook his head. "I'm in this because I choose to be." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but believing meant accepting that she was worth the cost. The next week would test them both. She could feel it in the air, as surely as the smell of rain before a storm. The rain started as a whisper against the windows of Daniel's office, a soft percussion that should have been soothing. But as the night deepened, the drizzle turned into a relentless downpour, the kind Charleston hadn't seen in weeks. Streets glistened under the street lamps, the air thick with the smell of wet asphalt and the brine blowing in from the harbor. Daniel sat at his desk long after the last of the staff had gone, staring at the stack of reports in front of him without really seeing them. The day's meetings had been nothing but careful wording, sideways glances, and the kind of boardroom politeness that hid sharpened edges. Through it all, Maggie's face kept appearing in his mind, her quiet strength, the way she stood her ground, even with the world closing in around her. He thought of her walking home in the rain, carrying the weight of other people's whispers, and in that moment, something inside him tipped. By the time he grabbed his coat and stepped outside, The rain was pounding so hard it flattened his hair to his forehead. He didn't care. The wipers fought to keep the windshield clear as he steered through the slick streets toward her apartment, the water pooling at curbs and running in silver ribbons down the gutters. Maggie had been curled on the couch, blanket pulled to her chin, the soft hum of a lamp keeping the shadows at bay. A half-finished chapter sat open on her laptop, her mind too crowded to write. She almost didn't hear the knock at first, 3 firm raps that cut through the muffled roar of rain. When she opened the door, the sight startled her. Daniel, rain dripping from the brim of his coat, water running down his jaw. His eyes, though clear and steady, were the same as the night he defended her in the boardroom. "You're soaked," she said, stepping back instinctively. "Get in before you catch." But he didn't move forward. Not yet. He stood there on the threshold, breathing hard, his hair plastered, his coat dark with rain. "I'm not losing you," he said, voice low but edged with steel. "Not over cowards, not over rumors, not over anything that doesn't matter compared to this." "Daniel," she began, but the words caught in her throat. He reached into the pocket of his coat, pulled out a small box black velvet, the kind that made time slow down. And right there, in the doorway with rain lashing at his back, he sank to one knee. "No pen names," he said, his voice steady over the sound of the storm. "No secrets, just us. Maggie Turner, will you marry me?" The world beyond them seemed to fall away. The rain, the street, the months of quiet glances and unspoken fear. All she saw was him, drenched and unshaken, offering her something she'd never truly let herself imagine. Her hand flew to her mouth, but the tears came faster than any words. They blurred her vision until all she could make out was the dark shine of his hair and the unwavering light in his eyes. She nodded once, then again until she found her voice. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes. Daniel. Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, warm from his hand despite the rain, and rose, pulling her into his arms. The blanket fell away. She didn't care that his coat was dripping onto the floor, that the rain wind curled in around them. For a long moment, they just held on to each other. His heartbeat was steady against her cheek. She breathed in the scent of rain and salt and the faint trace of his cologne, grounding herself in the reality of him, of them. "I don't care if the whole city talks," he murmured into her hair. "They can write whatever story they want. We'll write our own." She pulled back enough to look at him, searching his face. "This won't be easy." "It doesn't have to be easy," he said. "It just has to be ours." The storm outside rattled the windows, but inside, something deep and still settled between them, a quiet certainty that no boardroom vote or headline could touch. Later, after he'd shed his soaked coat and she'd wrapped him in one of her thickest towels, they sat together on the couch. The rain kept up its steady percussion against the roof, a soundtrack to the new chapter they'd just begun. Her fingers traced the ring, the simple band catching the lamplight. "You really just decided tonight?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I've been deciding for a while. Tonight just reminded me I didn't want to waste another day pretending this is anything less than what it is." She leaned into him, feeling the weight she'd been carrying shift, just enough to let in the warmth. "You know, I've written proposals before, dozens of them. But this, I think it's my favorite." He laughed quietly, the sound deep and warm. "Then I guess I'll take that as a yes to the first draft." Outside, the rain softened to a hush, the way it sometimes does just before dawn. In the small living room, they sat together, the quiet between them no longer heavy, but full of promise, of relief, of the kind of safety neither had dared to name. Somewhere down the block, a church bell marked the hour. She thought of all the stories she'd written, all the endings she'd imagined. None of them had looked like this, two people sitting in the half-light, soaked through, laughing softly with the future wide open before them. And yet, she realized this was exactly the ending she'd been writing toward all along. The days that followed felt like a blur of champagne-colored swatches, bakery samples, and a level of cheerful chaos neither Daniel nor Maggie had quite anticipated. Eleanor Prescott took to wedding planning with the same precision she once applied to managing her late husband's social calendar. Maggie had barely agreed to a venue before Eleanor was rattling off seating arrangements and debating the merits of peonies versus garden roses. Meanwhile, Aunt Carol brought her own brand of enthusiasm, arriving at Maggie's apartment one morning with a clipboard and a tote bag full of bridal magazines. "I've already booked us at 3 dress boutiques," she announced, "and I told them we're not leaving until you find the one." Maggie could only laugh, swept along in the tide of their combined energy. More than once, she and Daniel exchanged amused glances across the table as his mother and her aunt volleyed opinions like seasoned diplomats negotiating a peace treaty. One Saturday afternoon, during a cake tasting, Eleanor insisted on a tiered lemon chiffon with raspberry filling, while Carol was equally adamant about chocolate ganache. The debate was only settled when Daniel suggested both flavors, half the cake one way, half the other. Maggie nearly choked on her forkful of frosting from laughing. At Prescott Marine, the tension of the past months finally began to ease. The board, perhaps eager to put the controversy to rest, announced Maggie's promotion to Director of Communications, a role that made her a department head rather than Daniel's direct subordinate. The title change came with its own corner office overlooking the harbor, and a clear signal whatever had happened before. She was now an integral part of the company's future. On her first day in the new role, Daniel appeared at her doorway with a bouquet of white tulips. "From the CEO to the director," he said with a smile. "Consider this our first official interdepartmental collaboration." She rolled her eyes but kept the flowers on her desk, where the sunlight caught their petals each morning, in the middle of fittings and floral decisions. Maggie also signed the contract for her next novel. The story was set in a fictional harbor town that would feel familiar to her readers, but with one crucial difference at its heart was a captain who'd built a life protecting others, and the woman who'd finally convinced him to let himself be protected in return. On the dedication page, she wrote, "To the man who gave me a safe harbor." When she showed Daniel, he traced the words with his thumb, quiet for a moment. "I think that's the best review I've ever gotten," he said softly. One evening, as they left a florist appointment, rain threatened in the distance, clouds heavy over the water. Daniel took her hand as they walked along the pier, the air warm and smelling faintly of salt. "You realize they're planning this wedding like it's a state affair," he teased. She laughed. "Honestly, I'm just trying to keep up." "Good," he said, giving her fingers a squeeze. "Because if I learned anything from all this, it's that the best parts are the ones we didn't plan." She smiled, thinking back over the past months, the blind date neither of them wanted, the storm that brought him to her door, the ring still warm from his hand. And now, just weeks away, the wedding they both wanted. The tide lapped gently against the dock pilings. Somewhere behind them, a seagull cried out, and the sound of distant laughter carried from a waterfront cafe. The city was still full of noise and rumor, but here, between them, there was only the calm before the happiest kind of storm. Charleston harbor shimmered in the late afternoon light, the water catching the blush of a sinking sun. White flowers lined the railings of the old pier, their petals trembling in the ocean breeze. Between the blooms, lanterns shaped like miniature lighthouses swayed gently, casting warm pools of light over the weathered boards. The scent of salt and roses mingled in the air, and somewhere nearby, the low hum of a cello accompanied the gulls overhead. Guests were gathering, family in their best linen and silk, colleagues from Prescott Marine in crisp suits, all drawn to the heart of the pier where rows of white chairs faced the open water. Maggie stood inside the small boathouse at the pier's end, peeking out from behind a curtain. She could see Daniel greeting guests with a steady smile, his navy suit perfectly pressed, a single white tulip pinned to his lapel. For a moment, she simply watched him, how easily he moved from a handshake with an old dock worker to a warm embrace with her Aunt Carol. "Ready, sweetheart," Eleanor's voice came from behind her, soft but brimming with excitement. Maggie turned. Her gown was simple ivory satin that caught the light in every curve, the skirt falling like a quiet wave. Eleanor adjusted the veil, her hands surprisingly steady for someone who had been micromanaging flower placements just an hour ago. "You look beautiful," Eleanor whispered, "and happy. That's all I ever wanted to see." The music shifted. Maggie took a deep breath and stepped into the open air. Each footfall on the pier echoed in her ears, but the moment she saw Daniel's eyes clear, unwavering, everything else faded. When she reached him, he took her hands, his touch warm despite the cooling breeze. The officiant began, but Maggie barely heard the words, her heart thundering. When it was their turn to speak, Daniel's voice was low, meant for her, even though everyone could hear. "Maggie Turner, for 6 years you've been the quiet voice that kept my world in order. But somewhere along the way, you became the person I can't imagine a day without. I promise to listen more than I speak, to trust you more than my own stubborn instincts, and to make our home the safest harbor you'll ever know." She swallowed against the knot in her throat. "Daniel Prescott, you've weathered storms most people never see, and you still believe in calm seas. You've shown me that love can be steady without losing its spark, and I promise to meet you at every sunrise and every sunset, no matter the waters we sail through." As the officiant declared them husband and wife, the sky behind them flared in shades of coral and gold. Daniel kissed her, the dock beneath their feet creaking gently, the guests' applause rolling like distant surf. The reception unfolded right there on the pier tables, dressed in white cloths, platters of low-country shrimp and grits, champagne flutes catching the last of the sun. Laughter carried over the water, mingling with the faint strains of a jazz trio set up near the boathouse doors. Eleanor and Aunt Carol gave toasts, each full of stories, some sentimental, some embarrassing enough to make Daniel rub the back of his neck, while Maggie laughed until her eyes watered. Colleagues from the office raised their glasses too, Rebecca from accounting teasing that she wanted a character named after her in Maggie's next book. As twilight deepened, Daniel took Maggie's hand and led her to the edge of the pier. Moored there was a sleek white yacht, its name freshly painted along the bow, Safe Harbor. "A wedding gift," Daniel said, his voice touched with pride. "First vessel off the new Prescott Marine line, and I thought we should be the first to take her out." Guests gathered along the dock, waving as Daniel helped Maggie aboard. Lantern light danced on the water as the yacht eased away, the harbor opening wide before them. Maggie leaned into him, the city lights growing smaller behind them. The night air was cool now, but she felt only warmth, his arm around her, the steady hum of the engines, the knowledge that this was their first voyage as husband and wife. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks bloomed over the water, their reflections rippling toward the horizon. Maggie smiled. In all her books, she had written about perfect endings. But standing here with Daniel, the deck beneath her feet and the wind in her hair, She realized this wasn't an ending at all. It was the first chapter of something she couldn't wait to write. The first morning back from their short honeymoon, the world felt slower. Sunlight spilled through the wide kitchen window of Daniel's home on the harbor, warming the worn oak table where 2 coffee mugs steamed side by side. Beyond the glass, the water was calm, dotted with the silhouettes of early fishing boats making their way out to sea. Maggie sat in her robe, hair still tousled, notebook open in front of her. The quiet scratch of her pen was a counterpoint to the rustle of newsprint as Daniel turned a page. Every so often, she'd pause mid-sentence, watching the gulls skim the surface, or lean over to steal a bite of toast from his plate. No grand gestures, no audience, just the kind of peace she had once thought belonged to other people. A week after the wedding, Prescott Marine officially closed its internal investigation into the alleged financial leak from Maggie's novels. Robert Gaines issued a statement to the press. "We found no evidence of misconduct. Ms. Turner's work remains her own intellectual property, and her integrity in this matter is without question." The newspapers moved on to fresher scandals. The blogger who'd first speculated about her identity posted a quiet retraction. Even Linda Carver had sent a terse email congratulating her on the wedding and new chapter ahead. Daniel had insisted on reading that email out loud at breakfast, his grin making Maggie laugh until she nearly spilled her coffee. For Aunt Carol and Eleanor, the shift to post-wedding life meant redirecting their joint energy toward holiday plans. "Thanksgiving at your place," Carol declared one Sunday, already plotting the menu. Eleanor, never one to concede control entirely, volunteered to handle the seating arrangements, prompting a round of good-natured groans from everyone present. The warmth between the 2 women, so different yet so united in their affection for the couple, became a kind of anchor in itself. It was on a breezy Saturday afternoon, while Maggie was revising the final chapter of her next book, that Daniel appeared at her office door holding a thin envelope. "From the publisher," he said, handing it to her. Inside was the first printed dedication page to the man who gave me a safe harbor. She looked up at him, her throat tightening just a little. "Still think it's the best review you've ever gotten now more than ever," he said, kissing the top of her head before settling into the armchair by the window. The last of the loose threads tied themselves up in small, almost unremarkable ways. Calhoun, the board member who had walked out during that tense meeting months earlier, quietly resigned from his post, citing health reasons. Daniel never spoke of it in detail, but Maggie noticed the subtle ease in his shoulders afterward. Her newest book went to press without a single whisper of controversy. The launch party, held at the Harbor Lights Jazz Club, felt less like a media event and more like a gathering of old friends. Even the staff at Prescott Marine came, Rebecca from accounting, the junior accountant from the break room, each offering her copies to sign with genuine smiles. The people who mattered had stayed. The rest had drifted away like the outgoing tide. One evening, as they stood on the deck of Safe Harbor, the city lights a soft glow across the water, Daniel turned to her. "You know," he said, "I used to think love stories had to be big, the kind you read about in history books or see in films. But this," he gestured around them to the quiet marina, the boat rocking gently beneath their feet. "This is better." Maggie rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the faint scent of salt and cedar. "Some love stories aren't grand epics," she murmured. "They're quiet harbors, steady, safe, and exactly where you're meant to anchor." The choice they'd made together wasn't just to marry, it was to see each other fully, without pen names, without protective distance, without the fear of what others might say. to anchor not in the calmness of the water, but in the certainty of each other. And that was the truest ending of all. At any age, in any season of life, you are still worthy of a love that sees you completely, without disguise. A love that doesn't demand you be more or less than you are, but simply asks that you come home again and again to the place where you are most yourself. Some of life's most profound lessons come quietly, in moments we don't expect. Daniel and Maggie's journey reminds us that love can be found in familiar places, and sometimes the person who sees you most clearly has been beside you all along. It teaches us that protecting someone you care for isn't weakness, it's courage. And that truth, even when uncomfortable, has the power to set you free. For those of us who have lived through decades of change, it's easy to believe the best chapters are behind us. But this story whispers otherwise. Love, purpose, and new beginnings have no age limit. You are never too old to be truly seen, to take a risk for something or someone worth keeping. It also reminds us that storms will come, and people may judge without knowing the whole story. But a steady harbor is built through trust, patience, and the choice to stand together, even when the waves rise high. So, whether in love, friendship, or family, dare to hold on to the people who bring you peace. Because in the end, the safest place you'll ever find isn't a location. It's the heart you choose to anchor to. Thank you for spending your time with us and joining this heartfelt journey. If this story touched you, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need its message, and subscribe to our channel for more warm, inspiring stories. Your support helps us keep bringing these moments to life.